I dare say a copious cornucopia of organizational concepts and theories, at least in a formal sense, began to spring up at the turn of the 20th century, and the formulations and postulations have not ceased, relented, or even slowed, it seems. Several theories have shown increasing popularity over the years, such as resource dependence theory, population ecology, institutional, and agency theory. In simple terms, and for the most part, these organizational theories aspire to explain the why, what, and how of organizations. They may ask, what is the context that this organization exists in? And is there a way of systematizing organizational behavior? In today's presentation, we will look a little closer at two specific theories and their applications in a nonprofit setting. We will discuss resource dependence theory and population ecology theory. We will also touch on the interrelationships between these different theories. Resource dependence theory postulates that the availability of and dependence on resources ultimately affect an organization's behavior. Hillman, Withers, and Collins describe resource dependence theory as the understanding that external factors influence organizational behavior, and although they are constrained by their context, organizations can and will act to reduce environmental uncertainty and dependence. The model was first formalized by Pfeiffer and Salanchik, who used a theoretical framework to characterize organizations as open systems that are dependent on contingencies in the external environment. For example, an organization with only a single supplier is probably more dependent than those with multiple suppliers. The authors state that to understand the behavior of an organization, you must understand the context of that behavior, that is, the ecology of a system. There are a few different logical forms or syllogism variations for understanding resource dependence theory, but some of the basic common arguments would include that one, organizations are a fundamental unit for understanding relations within society. Two, organizations depend on resources, meaning that they depend on the environment for survival. Three, resources are a basis of power and control, and therefore are relational, situational, and potentially mutual. Four, these organizations are not autonomous, but rather interdependent because resources ultimately originate from the environment which contains other organizations. 5. Interdependence, when coupled with the uncertainty of how others will act, leads to a situation in which future success is uncertain. 6. Therefore, organizations take actions to manage those external interdependencies, although such attempts rarely succeed and often produce new patterns. And 7. These patterns of dependence produce inter and intra-organizational power, which has an impact on behavior. A minimalist explanation of all that would be that organizations basically seek to gain power over external factors through the control of resources. Intuitively, the procurement of resources is essential for the operations of any organization, as well as the ability to skillfully navigate constantly changing environments. These thoughts can also clearly be applied to other fields, such as biology, and that all living things depend on energy. And some would argue that life is simply a story about the struggle for energy. The state of things principally becomes a zero-sum game in which resources are limited, and therefore companies must prioritize their critical resources in order to function. Organizations must respond to and are constrained by their external environments. As Pfeiffer and Salanchik describe it, behavior becomes a consequence of influences. For example, companies with more governmental dependencies will conform more readily to public policy requests. Central to these responses and actions are the concepts of power and control. Organizations vie for power which is obtained by controlling vital resources, whether they act as owners, arbitrators, gatekeepers, or regulators of those resources. These power struggles then create interdependent relationships, ones that can be mutual, symbiotic, and synergetic, or they can become competitive, asymmetric, and unbalanced. Interdependence and power will depend on many factors, such as the demand of resources, customers and their demand being the most important resource, the availability of critical resources, and the allocation, stability, variability, and criticality of resources. Resource dependence theory can help explain some of the life cycles of nonprofit organizations, like the community center I currently work for. Many nonprofits struggle until they eventually close their doors or become more commercialized in their services. So what can be done? For one, resource dependence theory has many implications regarding the optimal structure and design of an organization. How should the nonprofit recruit, hire, develop, produce, market, and network? These decisions will need to be made in consideration of limited resources. Where is the funding located, and how reliable is it? Hillman, Withers, and Collins discuss that because firms are unable to reduce uncertainty and interdependence on the larger social systems, including the government, they undertake other means to reduce the uncertainty and interdependence. This is where we see organizations actively seeking to create their own environment through political machinations, such as lobbying, to try and shape public policies and regulations. Next, the nonprofit community center might also consider enacting multiple strategies to combat external contingencies. Pfeiffer and Salenchik again proposed several methods that organizations employ to minimize undesired environmental factors, such as merging and acquisitioning to diversify operations and manage interdependent sources of input and output. Finally, the community center will want to understand both the importance and the dangers of interrelationships with other entities. The nonprofit will want to build healthy individual-group relationships while minimizing toxic ones. Population ecology theory seeks to understand the conditions under which organizations emerge, grow, change, and expire. The theory was introduced and popularized by Hannan and Freeman and has become a central field in organizational research. Population ecology utilizes insights from biology, economics, and sociology to examine the environment in which organizations compete within a process likened to natural selection. Key concepts within population ecology are quite expansive and include selection and adaptation, inertia, units of analysis, social systems, partitioning, density dependence, isomorphism, competition theory, and niche theory. Hannan and Freeman provide a strong continuity of nature hypothesis. They propose that whenever the stated conditions hold, the models lead to valuable insights regardless of whether the populations under study are composed of protozoans or organizations. Therefore, companies naturally cycle through stages of birth, life, and death. Hawley's classic formulation posits that the diversity of organizational forms is isomorphic to the diversity of environments. Each unit experiences constraints which force it to resemble other units with the same set of constraints. For example, Hawley emphasized that populations eventually must submit to certain patterns, such as language, so as to function properly. So what does population ecology mean for the nonprofit? Well, for one, the nonprofit will want to have an understanding of the inertial pressures that foster competition and selection in populations of organizations. Inertial pressures arise from both internal structural arrangements and external environmental constraints. Internal constraints could include investments in buildings, equipment, and personnel. It could be the limit and flow of reliable information, internal politics, or resistant to and costs of adapting to environmental changes. External constraints include legal and fiscal barriers to entry and exit from markets, information constraints, obtaining legitimacy from the social environment, and the collective rationality problem where not all people make rational decisions at all times. From these, we might take away a few key observations. One, time perspective is crucial. The success and strength at one period and place does not necessitate success at another stage. And two, the challenges of a small nonprofit may drastically differ from a megacorporation, which can often reduce selection pressures through networks and resource linkages. Another important lesson that the community center can learn from population ecology is in developing a clear mission and vision. Purpose will ultimately define direction and the types of challenges that will accompany that pursuit. You could think about it this way. Struggling churches do not just decide to become retail stores, nor do corporate firms transfer themselves into monasteries. The physical brick-and-mortar buildings may close the doors and reopen for new business purposes, but the intangible organizations themselves do not metamorphose into completely different creatures. Lastly, the nonprofit should focus on developing its specific niche service. The niche then consists of all those combinations of resource levels at which the population can survive and reproduce itself. When organizations find their niche, they have essentially outcompeted all other local populations, and these contribute to the longevity of the organizations. In this presentation, we have reflected on two popular organizational theories and their applications in a nonprofit setting. But we can also observe the complex interrelationships between these different frameworks. For most, I think it is safe to agree that none of the aforementioned theories are sufficient on their own. Each approach can prove useful in an organizational analysis. The extreme complexity of organizational environments requires not one, but a set of approaches to increase understanding. Additionally, each model can be seen overlapping as both focus on the role of the external environment. Ulrich and Barney provided one of the earliest efforts at integrating these lenses, along with others, to provide a more holistic, meta-theoretical perspective of companies. The researchers suggest that population ecology's perspective of selection and survival coincides with a company's ability to reduce dependencies while gaining influential power. And so the reality is that some organizational theories will work better in certain cultural contexts than others, and relationship between individuals, groups, and cultures is reciprocal. The very nature of organizational theorizing draws on an interdisciplinary thinking. And thus, all organizations, the nonprofit included, will want to give thorough thought and consideration to the many theories and their potential applications. Thank you, and God bless.